Thank you for joining us for the Voices for Nature podcast with Chris Gambian and Jackie Mumford.
Welcome to the Voices for Nature podcast. I'm Jackie Mumford.
And I'm Chris Gambian. Today we are continuing our discussions with members of the New South Wales Parliament and the crossbench.
That's right. And today we're really excited to speak to two members of the upper house of New South Wales Parliament who both play a crucial role as crossbenchers. We'll be speaking to Cate Faehrmann, who's a member of the Greens and sits in the upper house representing the Greens, and independent MP Justin Field.
Now, both Justin and Cate will be very well known to a lot of people who are listening to this, and in particular, Cate would be well known as a former CEO of NCC, a predecessor of mine, and Justin himself also a former staff member at NCC. So hope you enjoy these discussions.
So lovely to have you here, Cate. I'm sure a lot of our supporters will remember you from your days at Nature Conservation Council, so it's lovely to see you again. Really interested to hear a bit about your journey from CEO at NCC into politics. How did you end up there?
Yeah, well, I was actually involved in the Greens before I started at the NCC. So I had been managing kind of election or involved in election campaigns as kind of like a campaigner and a media advisor from Victoria to New Zealand, South Australia, and I ended up in New South Wales to work on the 2003 state election campaign. Was always going to move back to Victoria at the time, which was my home at the time anyway. Got involved in the Greens here, met my current partner still, Paul Sheridan, and started working then for Lee Rhiannon as a media advisor. Then when I did get offered the job as Nature Conservation Council CEO, that was amazing. I quit the Greens. I said, I've got to be really, objective here, non-partisan, was head of the NCC for 4 years. Then I just ran for the casual vacancy that was created when Lee Rhiannon ran for the Senate, and got that, and then kind of moved on in. Obviously, I had rejoined by that time and moved into state parliament. And I tell you what, it was a really good basis to start as an MP here in New South Wales. I got the environment portfolio off in Cohen, and to have had that 4 years kind of working really at the coal front with so many communities was a very good a bit of life experience before I got in this place.
Yeah, wow.
Cate, there's a lot to love about nature in New South Wales, and as you've said, you've actually spent a fair bit of time all around the place, not just here in New South Wales. But what are some of the places you keep going back to, the sort of places that you love the most around New South Wales?
Yeah, I really have a soft spot for Cozzy in the summer. So I'm not a skier. In fact, I had a hideous ski accident, and I've just kind of haven't really got back on skis. Love the kind of alpine country in summer, is absolutely beautiful. So I go there a fair bit. I really love Mungo National Park as well. It's just such stark contrast. I can't believe we have such a huge variety of landscapes and ecosystems here in New South Wales. It's absolutely extraordinary. Then, of course, there's like Nightcap National Park, just the beautiful kind of Gondwana rainforest area of northern New South Wales, one of the most biodiverse places in the world. It's just, and the history of it as well, in terms of how those fantastic people in the north saved that incredible area. So yeah, they're kind of the spots. Everybody loves Royal, who lives in Sydney as well. Having said that, I reckon this weekend is going to be nuts in Royal. Everybody's going for their first bushwalk.
Absolutely.
But yeah, beautiful. Yeah, there's just so much to love about New South Wales generally when it comes to nature and national parks.
Jackie and I are heading north in a couple of weeks' time, now that lockdown is over, as soon as we're allowed into regional New South Wales. And so it's going to be exciting to see some of that. Haven't been there for a couple of years, so I think it's going to be great.
Yeah, I can't wait to get back out into nature.
Yeah, I can't wait either.
And Cate, you have a pretty unique perspective just from what you were saying before about your journey into politics. You know, at NCC, we are, fiercely non-partisan, and ideally what we would like to see is a race to the top on environmental issues from all sides of politics. Just keen to hear a little bit about that sort of inside track versus outside track, given that you have that, experience outside the tent trying to push the politics, and now you're there in Parliament. Could you just share some reflections on that and what you see as kind of the key sort of differences in your ability to affect change?
Yeah, there's an interesting kind of relationship as well, I think, between the NGO movement and the Greens. Like I've been very, very heavily involved and so loyal to the Greens. But then as soon as I kind of got to the environmental NGO world, I was very careful to be quite removed from the Greens and not seen as a Green, if you like. I don't think, if you think about, say, the Labor movement and Labor, obviously, we don't have a formal wing, if you like, of the NGO movement, but I think there's a little bit more criticism of that. So that's interesting. I got a very good understanding at NCC of how important it is to be able to really have a strong movement and be able to demonstrate to whoever's around the cabinet table with the environment portfolio that we are a strong and very powerful kind of movement, the importance of continuing to organise protests, the importance of lobbying, all of that. And I got a big insight then into, to be honest, just how much across the political spectrum, people kind of do care about the environment. Like politicians, like from all persuasions, although potentially one party probably needs to care a little bit more, and that would be the Nationals. But politicians from all parties do actually care a lot about the environment, and it's kind of more the path that we take to get there, and unfortunately also the influence of vested interests. So yeah, from an insider's perspective, I look out and see, okay, NGOs play a really, really, really important role in making MPs in this place aware that there is an issue. If NGOs in the community aren't speaking out about a problem, the politicians aren't going to act on anything like that. That's absolutely fundamental.
Yeah,
Hey,
right.
my introduction to NCC was at the time you were CEO, when you organised the Walks Against Warming. Can you tell us a bit about that time? Because that was quite a different time in terms of the climate debate. And how did it happen? How did you manage to turn that number of people out for what I think will go down in history as some of the most important moments in the climate movement in New South Wales?
Yeah, this came about. Fundamentally, I started at the NCC, was very surprised at the lack of climate action taking place at New South Wales at a time when there was this increasing focus on the Howard government not wanting to sign on to the Kyoto Protocol, the influence of the fossil fuel industry kind of lobbying around greenhouse policy at the time. There were Four Corners exposés on just how much influence that these vested interests have. But there wasn't really any actions taking place. I'm a strong believer in the fact that unless you see people out on the streets calling for action around particular issues, then it's not really a big, it's not going to change things politically. If you think about all the movements, the big change that we get, there is always action and protest on the streets. So there wasn't anything happening with climate change. And I'm like, we've got to create a big rally. We've got to get that movement happening. So there were two parts of it. First was protest. The first street march that we organised actually had a few thousand people, which we were pretty proud of. That was in 2005. We had 2006 was the 2007 was the Al Gore kind of era. 2006 was when it was getting kind of really big. I think, or have I got that wrong by a year? The other really,
I think you do have it out by 1 year.
Was Al Gore, wasn't it? And then 2007 was the federal election with Kevin Rudd. That's right. Yeah. So 2004 to 5 was when we also recognised, okay, to create one person doesn't create a movement, a handful of people don't create a movement, really. Like, you've got to go beyond that. So we said, okay, we've got to get action groups started in places across New South Wales, so residents' action groups. I did town hall meetings in places and basically talked about climate change with various other speakers, and then said, okay, what's next? Start a resident action group, start a community group against climate change. So there was that happened. So we at the NCC played a critical role in building what we actually call climatemovement.org.au, and supported with resources, supported these groups starting from Bega to Balmain to other places around. So that was critical. So 2006 happened, and 2006 with Al Gore happened at the same time, about 6 weeks out from Walk Against Warming. It couldn't have been more perfect. So we actually started getting mainstream media really interested in climate change. I remember doing interviews on Triple M, Kate Blanchett went to it. We had something like 30,000 people in Martin Place. It was massive, 100,000 people across the country. Then from that following year, we deliberately made it political. We deliberately held it 2 weeks out from a federal election with a floating date. As people know, we don't know when a federal election is going to be called. So a logistical nightmare. But I have always been, like, some people do rallies without political speakers, right? I understand why they do that, kind of, but I firmly believe that it's about, firstly, media will probably pay it more attention. You want to put those politicians on the stage and get them to, put their money where their mouth is. And to be honest, they need to make those promises, and sometimes it can get promises out of people. So yeah, that's what we did. And yeah, I do think it was incredibly important. 2 weeks before the federal election in 2007, we had, Peter Garrett, who was in Labor at the time, Bob Brown, other people kind of lined up front. It was the top news item on all of the stations 2 weeks out that 100,000 people have marched for climate change. So yeah, you've got to start somewhere, which we did. You never know where it'll end up, I suppose.
Yeah. And you've obviously been following the politics in New South Wales and the country around climate and nature for quite a while. What do you reckon these most recent changes in New South Wales government will mean for nature in New South Wales?
Well, we have for the first time ever, we've got an environment minister who is treasurer, even temporarily. So I would be and am calling on Matt Kean to kind of put his money where his mouth is in terms of nature. He has been a environment and energy minister with a bigger focus on energy than environment. We know here in New South Wales and indeed across the country, where we have coalition governments with Liberal and Nationals, the Nationals are pretty much in control of everything that really matters when it comes to environment. We know Matt Kean's in charge of national parks, but it's very difficult to get any other action at the moment because the National Party is the National Party. However, with Barilaro gone and that kind of, him putting a line in the sand around koalas and the terrible Local Land Services Act, we've got a bunch of issues coming up, such as private native forestry, private native forestry, the new codes. We need to wait and see what happens with this. But I don't know. I would like to think that with a new kind of, National Party lineup as well, that these campaigns to get the National Party to have another look, for example, at these types of things. I don't know. We've got to kind of campaign somewhere. But I don't hold out much hope until the state election in terms of getting any significant change. We've been calling, for example, for a Great Koala National Park, which is essentially transitioning a hell of a lot of state forests into national parks for koalas. Of course, the Greens want to see a transition out of state forests entirely, but that's not going to happen as far as I can see for a little while longer. But with Kean as treasurer, wouldn't you think that now this is his opportunity to just throw money at the situation, which would be look at what a structural adjustment package is for these forestry workers, map it out over several years. Of course, nothing's ever immediate, but this is his moment to get something like this done. John Barilaro's gone. The National Party's got a new leadership. I would be thinking that, Kean could really make his mark in the environment side of things before he actually hands that over.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Kate, there's a lot, there are a lot of threats to nature. The risk of climate change, well, it's not a risk anymore. It's happening. We're seeing the impacts. We're seeing the consequences. We talked a moment ago about Mungo National Park and, the landscape there. But of course, the big story in that area as well is the Barker and, the fact that 2 summers ago there was no water in it. and it's likely to be the case that there won't be water in there in the future. There's a lot to be worried about. There's a lot to be angry about. Do you ever feel like giving up? Do you ever feel like it's too hard? And on the flip side of that question, what does keep you going? What gives you hope?
Yeah, no, I don't feel like giving up, because it would be so frustrating to wake up and then not feel like you're doing anything about the state of the world and just be frustrated. So that's a big deal. I also meet incredibly amazing, passionate young people who actually give me a hell of a lot of hope. The past couple of years, particularly young women, kind of school age women, and what their passion and how smart they are about solutions for the future. We had a girls take over Parliament last week, where we did kind of different mentoring sessions with groups of school aged young women. So incredibly inspiring, honestly. So firstly, there's this generation that is just going to shake things up so much. So that's exciting. That kind of gives me hope, if you like. Things, even now in the lead up to COP26 in Glasgow, yes, it's really bloody so frustrating to finally see, yes, they all had to come over at some stage. Yes, it's a kind of, it's a 2050 net zero 2050 target. We know we have to take so much more action, but what is happening in terms of the global conversation and even the national conversation now around coal and climate change is like, oh my God, do we dare hope that this is actually something is going to happen? So you can't give up, because the changes we make now, we haven't stopped, I don't think, clearly catastrophic climate change kind of happening, but the changes we make now could mean that we stop the very worst happening, and we actually are then able to create a future that is okay. And I think those of us within the environment movement who have been here for some time recognise, there is the reality that things are going to get worse before they get better. In terms of what gets me out of bed every day, I just get it's almost like the anger and the passion, like, how dare they do this? The vested interests and the National Party, for goodness sake, that continue to, talk about propping up coal, that continue to want to clear forests, continue to sow this kind of division with regional New South Wales and farmers and greenies, if you like. That shouldn't be there. They have just held us back for so long. So people like big miners, Minerals Council, the National Party, the guys basically, largely, I just get so angry that I just want to kind of get out of bed every morning and go, no, I'm not going to let you get away with it. And there's so many people in the community who feel the same way. So they say, oh my God, thank goodness someone is in that place. I don't know how you can stand it, Cate, but thank goodness you're there. Thank goodness there are good people like you there. Thank you for kind of speaking out for us. And I go out to the community and say, thank you for just fighting and campaigning so bloody hard, the tens of thousands of hours that people put in for our environment, for koalas, for, threatened northern corroboree frogs in Kossi, is ridiculous. That's what inspires me as well. And to be honest, that's the better part than the awful, vested interest fat blokes in suits that I was talking about before.
Yes, gosh, it really is a place with all sorts of people, hey, in that Parliament where you are there. Mm-hmm. And I guess one part of your job does involve with working with people across different colours of politics. How do you go working with the people that you have to across the spectrum?
Yeah, so I reckon that's one of the kind of almost the hidden secrets that people don't really like to talk about too much publicly, is that a lot of us do get on really well and work together for outcomes. Like, we get out publicly and we, whack each other around the head a bit, and then you'll see us working in committees and stuff and, talking on the phone before committee meetings and just trying to kind of work out solutions to kind of complex issues, right? So an example is the inquiry that I've literally just reported on today into kangaroos, which obviously the government is just so far apart from where Animal Justice Party, the other crossbench member, is, and me as the Greens chair. But we actually kind of worked on, like, we didn't talk before the committee in terms of, agreeing on recommendations, but I kind of understood that they were trying to go as far as possible in acknowledging there was a problem. They weren't coming and just going, no, we're going to block that or whatever. And actually, we got a really solid report at the end of it. Penny Sharp from Labor was on there as well. And we kind of worked together knowing, there is an issue. We're not going to agree on all of this, but there's a problem. So there's a problem in the way in which kangaroos are managed, and there's cruelty issues, and there's modelling doubts, all this stuff. So yeah, we work together. We actually work together reasonably well. Having said that, there's also times when you're just infuriated with how a debate or something plays out. But ultimately, some of us can call each other friends, and there's really unusual kind of alliances across the kind of party divide. Like Helen Dalton, for example, and I work very closely on water issues, and you'll probably find us, spot us having a, drink together at the end of a parliamentary sitting week sometimes too. So, and that is not unusual across party.
It's good to hear.
Cate, this is a question we're asking everybody, which is, for a lot of people, it can feel frustrating to get the attention of politicians, to get to get heard in the first place. And on the flip side, we do sometimes hear from politicians goes, sometimes you don't make it easy to hear us, to be heard. So what do you think your advice would be for folks to get the attention of politicians collectively or individually? And specifically in the case of the Greens, how does the Greens make decisions about issues? Like, how do you collectively sort of come up with the approach you'll take to a particular issue, or what you'll decide to make important in terms of your program?
Yeah, great. So the first one around how do you get MPs' attention? So I always think that environmental organisations kind of working together on particular issues, all kind of coming together and saying, this is an issue that I think we all need to agree to lobby these politicians about, is always good. So there are so many different environmental issues going on across the state, whether it's like at a really local level, or of course big global issues like climate change and water or whatever. But just that agreement in some ways, if there's a local campaign that they've just discovered that this is an issue, just trying to get like most of the NGOs at least identifying it and communicating to MPs. That's actually a really good thing to do. Also, emails. Don't think that people are sick of getting emails from people. We look at all the emails, read the emails. If you're getting 20 or 30 emails about a particular issue from the community, you know that there's a hell of a lot of other people out there who aren't writing emails, who are concerned. So that's really good. Phone calls, the good old phone calls. We don't get many phone calls these days, so everybody emails. So phone calls are very good as well. The kind of old-fashioned things like letters to the editor, honestly, though, I am surprised politicians still read the letters page. They all still read the letters page. I'm kind of a bit like obsessed with, who's doing what on Facebook and Twitter, but yeah, the letters page. So all of that matters, as does your, Facebook, Twitter. Just raising awareness. Also getting unexpected allies is really, really good. So we've always got this community, people who probably are your usual suspects who are concerned about environmental issues. Get a couple of local business owners and others to front that campaign. I always recommend to people. In terms of the Greens, how we make decisions, we have, close to 50, I think, local groups across New South Wales. Those groups can put forward recommendations for campaigns or policy. We have an environmental action working group that meets monthly, where we take different issues. If I get emailed, for example, a local issue across New South Wales, if I get that email and I think the Environmental Action Working Group should hear about this and discuss it, that's a way for the party to agree on something. We also have this kind of committee that is a conduit, if you like, between the party and the MPs to kind of recommend things as well. every single state delegates council that we have, that we report back on our kind of priorities and any new things, and we get feedback that way. Also, we have this really amazing policy making process where all Greens can feed into the policy, highly consultative. Some people might think it takes a little bit too long, but it is incredibly democratic. And if you join the Greens, you'll be able to have a say in everything. So you have a say in everything if you want, or nothing. That's what it is.
There you go. There's a free plug for joining the Greens as well.
Hey, you've got your koala shirt on today, and you've got some beautiful koala posters there behind you. And, koalas are a really core issue for us at NCC too. And, a lot of sort of flux in the policy landscape around protecting koalas. What are sort of the next steps on protecting koalas, in terms of your priorities, and what are some of the sort of key moments you think people should be getting involved in?
Yeah, so we've got state election. No, the first one is local government, which has been deferred so much, as we know, in December, I think on the 3rd of December, that we, with council campaigns, particularly in kind of koala areas on the mid-north coast and north coast, we're asking people to kind of get involved in that around koala plans and management, and making sure that council candidates, if you like, run on a strong koala protection platform. That's the first thing for us. I think my sense is, with where the government is at on this, I have heard that the new koala strategy has potentially been paused. That koala protection is being increasingly focused on acquiring particular land that may be koala habitat. I think the government from that might be giving up in terms of trying to, I don't know where the changes to the Local Land Services Act that have to come before the Parliament, as well as the changes to the Private Native Forestry Code, they have to come before Parliament. I haven't heard anything. Obviously, COVID has kind of slowed that down. What I can say for sure is that the campaign to protect koala habitat in New South Wales hasn't stopped. We've got the Great Koala National Park campaign. I think we need to be campaigning very strongly for transitioning state forests, into national parks, particularly in that Great Koala National Park area. We've got to tighten up the land clearing codes. That's a massive campaign. And I think, to be honest, that will be a 2023 state election campaign. We know that Labor, for example, are also appalled at the changes under the Liberal National Government to our Native Veg Act, to the land clearing laws. So for me, given it's, where are we, October 2021, we are now starting to build the campaign, leading into 2023 around the basically threatened species, biodiversity conservation. Koalas will play a big role, but we are still seeing so much koala habitat being cleared, like just piecemeal stuff, despite the koala report, despite the recommendations in that report that we can't afford to lose any more habitat. We are still seeing so much clearing being signed off, particularly when it comes to urban development, and Campbelltown is a case in point.
Hey, Cate, thanks so much for taking the time to chat to us. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jackie. That was fun.
Hey, Justin, thank you so much for joining us. You are probably best known in conservation movement circles at the moment for being the person holding together a fairly delicate coalition of people in the upper house when it comes to things like floodplain harvesting. What's it like? What's being an independent in the upper house like compared perhaps to people in some of the other parties?
Well, I've got, some experience of one party, and that being the Greens. So I don't, I'm not going to speak for the different feeling, for those in other parties. But for me, it's been a bit of a breath of fresh air, to be honest. I get to focus exclusively on the issues, which is a luxury that not everyone has. And we can have a parliament of just all independent. So I appreciate that's a privilege, but it does enable me not to have to worry and focus on internal management of party issues. I just focus on the issue. and I focused on environment issues, and water to a large degree has been a big part of my experience in the Legislative Council in the last few years. And floodplain harvesting is coming to a critical time in sort of the policy settings. And yeah, it's an interesting coalition, left and right wing crossbenchers, obviously with the Labor opposition, has meant that we can hold the line with the government and try and leverage that power to get better outcomes for particularly the Murray-Darling Basin and the Darling River in particular, when it comes to what could be a pretty substantial additional take, let's be clear, of water that we just can't afford, particularly with climate change.
What's that like? So you mentioned it's quite a broad coalition. You've got shooters, you've got Greens, you've got Animal Justice, you've got Labor, you've got One Nation, all sort of sticking together on this issue, which is, it's not an uncontroversial issue. It's probably one of the most controversial in the state at the moment. How do you do it? I mean, how do you align those interests and keep people kind of on the same track?
Well, I'll be honest, Chris, I haven't necessarily done it. There is a confluence of interests. There is a complexity here that has meant, the role I can play is trying to help digest the complexity of this for the members and some of their stakeholder groups. And the reality is that floodplain harvesting benefits a handful of very large corporate irrigator interests. Overwhelmingly, the benefits of getting this right, of ensuring that when it floods, the water can get downstream for our rivers, to be available for communities and to be available for other water users, including other water license holders and even irrigators. The overwhelming benefit is getting this policy right, not gifting billions of litres and billions of dollars worth of licenses to a handful of large corporate irrigators. So the politics of this sort of makes sense. The shooters obviously have an interest in those electorates because they cover the vast majority of the Murray-Darling Basin in New South Wales. One Nation has had an interest here, in part because of how this has played out federally, in part because, the concerns of the Southern Basin irrigators, I think, has been influential in that discussion. Obviously, environmentally focused parties and members get that we need to ensure the law in New South Wales that prioritises rightly environmental needs over consumptive needs of irrigators is actually put in place in water policy. So this water should go downstream when it is needed, not be harvested in upstream dams. So that all makes sense. And credit to the Labor Party, who have stuck their dig on this issue. It is one of the few issues they really have come out and taken a very clear position opposed to what's being put forward from the government. And we've got this unique opportunity where we can leverage Parliament, and they've been prepared to do that. And there's been some criticism from stakeholder groups in the government of that, but they've understood and taken the time to understand the issues and taken a principled view. And so they should have that credit too. And the role I play, not having any particular power, don't have the balance of power, I've just spent the time really understanding the issue and talking to people.
The upper house is a rarefied environment. You got elected a couple of years ago. Talk to us a little bit about that pathway. How does Justin Field, the sort of knockabout teenager who probably just liked going surfing, turn into Justin Field, the MLC? Are you the Honourable? Do you carry the title? Who is making sort of important political decisions for the state?
Well, I'm not the Honourable officially. I'd like.
You are very honourable, though. You are. You
like
are
to think I act honourably, and I do take seriously the role, and I also recognise that in making a decision to leave the Greens and to sit as an independent, I had given personal undertakings to represent the environment in my campaign within the Greens to fill the casual vacancy that was in the Parliament in 2016 when I came in. And so I've tried to be really true to that. But my background wasn't environmental. Yes, I was a knockabout surfer for a lot of years, and I like to still be a bit. But people will know that I went to Duntroon through military college. I spent 7 years in the army as an army intelligence officer, and my entry to politics really was me developing an opposition to our involvement in the Middle East wars, and that was my entry point into politics. Watching Bob Brown advocate so passionately against Australia's involvement in the war, and then what I saw as the misrepresentation of our involvement by the Howard government at the time. That was my entry to Greens politics. But once I got involved with the party, I became really involved in natural resource management issues. My parents' farm in Queensland, we had a pawpaw and mango farm. It was compulsorily acquired by the Queensland government to turn into a massive shale oil region up near Gladstone, and now that industry didn't go ahead. It didn't work. It was toxic. So they just used the area as the corridor for the LNG pipelines to run to Curtis Island, and my parents can see the flares from those LNG plants from their backyard out on the island. So, I have seen firsthand that juxtaposition of really intensive mining on regional communities and agriculture. And I keep getting drawn back into these natural resource management issues. And so coal seam gas, when I was working in Parliament for Jeremy Buckingham, was a huge campaign. And it was really those environment campaigns that I guess built my reputation in the party, built my support that led to me winning the pre-selection to come into this place. And to be honest, I've just stuck with that. I've taken a path to ensure I can be as effective as I can in advocating for those issues. And I do that on water and forests and land management. And I just keep getting dragged back into these fights because they are the most important fights, and they are the thing that coalition government, when there's the National Party are involved, it's terrible. It's the worst. We are going backwards at a rate of knots on these things.
What do you think the change of government in New South Wales, or the change of leadership in the government, means for some of those issues that you're quite passionate about?
The jury's out, because at the end of the day, the coalition agreement with the National Party means that there is often very little room to move, regardless of who the leader or the environment minister is, when it comes to water, land management, native vegetation, forestry. All of those policy areas, the ministers are National Party ministers. And we've seen how the National Party can threaten to blow up the coalition over these issues. Now, I have some hope. I do think that we have in the new Premier, Dominic Perrottet, we've got a fresh set of eyes. I think we've also got someone who recognises their sort of more right-wing social policy position in some way needs to be offset. And I'd like to think, given some of the things that have been said and done already, and with Matt Keane as Treasurer, I'd like to think that he would probably soften that image, try to soften that political image by being greener. Certainly on climate change, the New South Wales government has taken a strong position. The actions are not quite there yet, I'll be honest, but the policies and the rhetoric is good. But I keep coming back, Chris, to the biodiversity stuff, the real core things around natural resource management. It is very hard for a Liberal Premier and Liberal Treasurer and Environment Minister to move the National Party. That is the barrier here.
When you look around this state, it's a big state. You live on the South Coast. What are the places? What are your favourite places in New South Wales?
Well, yeah, my new favourite place is North Durras. Actually, we've been spending some time down there. It's only half an hour from my place. I spent a lot of time out in the forests around South Broome and Shallow Crossing with campaigners. It's about 20 k's as the crow flies from my house, really badly affected by the bushfires. But, we do live in a beautiful state. Its natural resources are its assets. I've spent a lot of time out in the northwest as well, on the Liverpool Plains, and that beautiful landscape too really grabs me. Look, you can make the most of the environment in New South Wales, really, wherever you are. But I am probably a coastie. I'm a beach person. The South Coast coastal environment, our coastal lakes and our beaches are really just truly spectacular.
Okay, I can't let you get away without asking you this one, because everybody wants to know. But March 2023, your term expires. What's next for Justin Field?
Surfing.
I think there's a lot of people listening who will hope that you decide to have a crack at staying in the Parliament. But hey, thanks so much for taking the time to chat to us.
Real pleasure, Chris, and thank you for what you've been doing, your leadership at the Nature Conservation Council. It is an absolute critical time for the environment in New South Wales. Unless we see a big change from this government, I think we need a change of government if we're going to get a turnaround, particularly in those natural resource management and environment issues. And the NCC and its member groups and supporters play a critical role in raising awareness and hopefully shifting the dial when it comes to the next election in New South Wales.
Thank you, mate.
So that was Cate Faehrmann and Justin Field, both really important things, had really important things to say about the role that they play, working with, both government and the Labor Party to try and get better outcomes for nature. It's quite interesting to hear that important role that MPs play and the sort of inside track role that crucial players can play inside Parliament, but also, how we as outsiders, if you like, or people in the NGO and activist space can work with members of Parliament to get better outcomes for nature.
Absolutely. And if you think about the Parliament in the last couple of years, the best results that we've had for nature have been a direct result of the work of these two people. The politics around floodplain harvesting at the moment is really being led, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that Justin Field is very much leading the charge there and holding together a really surprising alliance of people to keep that regulation in check. And Cate Faehrmann on koalas last year when the bill was defeated, as Catherine Cusack herself said to us when we interviewed her earlier in the year. She was one vote, and she might have been the final and deciding vote, but there were all those other members that voted against the bill as well, and that was because of the advocacy of Cate in particular and the committee that she led last year. So we've got two good ones there.
That's right, and it's so important to have champions inside Parliament for our issues. So the importance of having relationships with those MPs and making sure that they're really kind of wheeling the barrow of the issues that we care about and that the conservation movement cares about. So it's wonderful to have their leadership inside Parliament on those issues.
As always, you can listen to this episode on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts, or catch us on YouTube. And if you like our work, if you can afford a few bucks to chip in and keep us going, it'd be very much appreciated, because
koalas grow on trees, but money does not.
Money definitely does not. So Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next time. Hopefully, our next interview is going to be with Matt Keane, now Treasurer of New South Wales, and with any luck, he'll be able to be a strong advocate for the environment in this new capacity.
That's right. Thanks, folks.
Thank you for joining us for the Voices for Nature podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, head to our website, YouTube, or your favourite podcast player to find more.